Judas Iscariot left that room while the city was still awake. And maybe that detail is heavier than it first seems, because at that exact moment, Jerusalem was still alive. The streets were still crowded. Vendors were still shouting over one another. The smell of baked bread and burning meat still drifted through the narrow alleys. Pilgrims slept shoulder to shoulder inside overcrowded homes because of Passover. But Judas walked alone, with coins hidden beneath his clothing, 30 pieces of silver, the payment for handing over a man who only days earlier had been welcomed like a king by the crowds. And here's something most people never stop to imagine. The Bible shows the betrayal. It shows the kiss. It shows the regret. But it doesn't show every detail of what happened afterward. How did Judas spend those final hours? What did he see while walking through the city? What was happening inside the mind of a man marked by priests, hated by the disciples, and now hunted by his own conscience? Because Jerusalem at that time was not a quiet place. It was tense, violent, controlled by Rome, filled with soldiers, filled with religious extremists, filled with fear. And a man accused of betraying a popular leader could disappear very easily inside those streets. What happened to Judas after the betrayal is not just a religious story, it's a human story about guilt, fear, desperation, and what it felt like to live through the darkest hours of the city where Jesus was condemned. But there's another detail that makes the story even stranger. After Judas died, different versions of his ending began to spread. Some people claimed one thing, others told a different story. And that's where everything becomes even more disturbing. Jerusalem during Passover did not feel like a normal city. Its population practically doubled. Thousands of pilgrims arrived from different regions: Galileans, Jews from distant lands, merchants, priests, Roman officials watching everything closely. The narrow streets became suffocating. The air carried a constant mixture of sweat, dust, animals, and smoke. Lambs were sacrificed near the temple. Blood ran through carved stone channels. Flies gathered across parts of the ground. And hanging over all of it was political tension. Rome knew Passover was dangerous because that celebration reminded people of liberation. The Jews celebrated the Exodus, their escape from slavery in Egypt, and any charismatic leader could ignite rebellion. That's why extra soldiers were sent into Jerusalem during that season. Armed men patrolled the gates, the walls, and the areas surrounding the temple. Now imagine Judas walking through that environment. He was not an unknown man. He belonged to Jesus's group. People had probably seen him standing beside Jesus many times before. But after the arrest in Gethsemane, everything changed quickly. The name Judas suddenly carried something dangerous: traitor. But there's an important detail here. Judas probably never expected things to end this way. Many historians believe he may have thought Jesus would react, that he would resist, that he would reveal power. But when Jesus allows himself to be arrested without resistance, when he is humiliated, when the condemnation begins, reality crashes down on Judas with brutal force. And that is exactly where one of the darkest moments in the entire biblical narrative begins. Because the Bible talks about his remorse, but it never describes the emotional weight of it. It never describes what it felt like to wake up in a Jerusalem drowning in chaos, knowing the man you handed over was now being led to his death. And the worst part? Judas was still carrying the coins. Jerusalem was not grand like Rome. It was cramped, noisy, uneven. Most houses were built from pale stone, often unfinished. Narrow streets twisted between tall walls. Stairways appeared without warning. Small alleys opened into crowded markets filled with smoke and animals. During the day, the heat clung to the skin. Dust rose with every step. Sandals scraped against worn stone. Children ran between merchants carrying dried fruit, bread, and water. But that particular week felt different. The city was overflowing. Pilgrims slept in courtyards, on rooftops, and even beside the outer walls. Animals filled improvised spaces. Voices speaking in different accents echoed constantly through the streets. and towering above everything else, the temple, massive, white, overwhelming. Its enormous stones reflected sunlight with almost blinding intensity. From the upper courts, religious trumpets marked the hours of prayer. Priests moved in organized groups. Temple guards watched every movement carefully, and the smell there was impossible to ignore. Burning incense, roasted meat from sacrifices, fresh blood running through channels near the altar. Jerusalem was a city where devotion and brutality existed side by side. And on the night after the betrayal, the city must have felt completely different to Judas. Places that once felt familiar now felt threatening. Every corner could hide someone who recognized his face. Every conversation could be about Jesus. And there's something important most people never think about. Jerusalem's nights were not silent, especially during Passover. Torches lit sections of the streets. Roman guards moved in pairs. The metallic sound of armor echoed in the distance. Dogs barked near dark alleys. Drunken men argued outside taverns. Pilgrims still moved through the city carrying goods and animals late into the night. Now imagine Judas crossing through all of that alone. No disciples, no protection, no direction, only the weight of silver hidden beneath his clothes. Every step probably felt heavier than the last. Because he knew something most people in Jerusalem still didn't know. Jesus had already been arrested, and while the city continued breathing normally, something irreversible had already begun. But there's an even darker detail. The area where Judas likely wandered that night was surrounded by political fear. Rome did not tolerate unrest. Any rumor of rebellion could end in public execution. Crosses were not uncommon outside the city. Sometimes condemned men were left hanging near roads as warnings. Bodies decayed beneath the heat. The smell could reach travelers passing nearby. Violence was part of everyday life, and Judas knew that. He knew what Rome did to men considered dangerous. But maybe he still didn't fully understand that now. He was part of that story too, because in that moment, he no longer truly belonged to the followers of Jesus, or to the authorities who had used him. And this is where his loneliness becomes truly terrifying. Jerusalem was a divided city, not only by walls, but by power, money, and fear. While some lived near the temple in large stone houses with inner courtyards and water reservoirs, most people survived inside cramped, dark spaces with little air. Entire families slept in the same room. The smell of burned oil, sweat, and cheap food stayed trapped inside the houses. Windows were small, fresh air barely entered. And in the streets, social differences were impossible to hide. Wealthy priests walked in clean garments made from expensive fabrics. Some members of the religious elite had direct political influence. They negotiated with Roman authorities, controlled parts of the temple economy, managed large amounts of money. Meanwhile, ordinary people lived on the edge of survival. Stoneworkers, fishermen, craftsmen, porters, women selling bread, men carrying water through the streets. Life depended on daily labor. If someone became sick, hunger arrived quickly. And mixed into that massive crowd were the most feared men in the city, Roman soldiers. They were impossible to mistake. Metal armor, heavy military sandals, short swords fastened against the body, spears reflecting torchlight. You could hear them before you saw them. Metal striking metal, synchronized footsteps, sharp commands spoken in Latin. The Roman presence created constant tension, because any disagreement could turn violent instantly. The soldiers had authority to beat, arrest, or even kill, and the people hated them for it. But they were too afraid to openly resist. Now imagine Judas witnessing all of this after Jesus' arrest, because the Romans were not watching only Jesus. They were watching anyone connected to him who might spark unrest. And here's another heavy detail. The disciples were probably already hiding. After the arrest in Gethsemane, the group scattered. The fear was real. Being associated with Jesus at that moment could mean interrogation, imprisonment, or death. So Judas became something rare and dangerous. a completely isolated man inside a hostile city. But it wasn't only the Romans who inspired fear. The religious leaders held enormous social power. The priests controlled major decisions, influenced trials, determined who was accepted or rejected within religious life. And in a deeply religious society, being rejected by spiritual authorities could destroy a person completely. Now think about Judas's position. The disciples would see him as a traitor. The priests did not love him, they simply used him. And the crowd could change its mood very quickly. That was how Jerusalem worked. One day, someone was celebrated. The next day, they could be publicly destroyed. And there's something deeply human about all of this. Judas probably recognized many faces in those streets. Perhaps merchants. Perhaps people who had heard Jesus teach. Perhaps pilgrims who had witnessed the miracles, and now he needed to avoid eye contact, avoid questions, avoid recognition, because the guilt was no longer only inside him. It was beginning to exist in the atmosphere around him, in the whispers spreading through the streets, in the rumors near the temple, in the conversations between strangers. It was him. Very few sentences could feel heavier than that in Jerusalem. But the worst part was only beginning, because Jerusalem did not merely judge people. It emotionally crushed those who lost their place within it. And Judas was about to discover that in the most brutal way possible. To understand what happened to Judas, you first need to understand what survival in Jerusalem was really like. Because the city moved at a relentless pace, the day began early, very early. Before sunrise fully touched the rooftops, footsteps already echoed through the stone streets. Merchants organized goods, women ground grain, animals were led toward markets or sacrifice. The morning air mixed the smell of baking bread, charcoal smoke, and sewage flowing through open channels. Yes, Jerusalem was dirty. Animal remains, blood flowing from the temple area, stagnant water in certain corners, insects swarming around the markets. The holy city was also an exhausted city. Most people worked until their bodies ached. Men carried heavy loads beneath brutal heat. Fishermen spent hours cleaning nets and fish. Stoneworkers inhaled dust all day long. Cracked hands were common. So were wounded feet. And one thing dominated people's minds every single day: survival, finding food, paying taxes, avoiding trouble, not drawing Rome's attention. Now imagine Judas trying to keep moving through that environment after the betrayal, because the world around him continued functioning normally. People still bought food, still bargained in the markets, still argued over prices. But for Judas, everything probably felt distant, as if Jerusalem itself had become unrecognizable overnight. And here we reach a powerful psychological detail. In that culture, honor and shame carried enormous weight, far more than they do today. A person's reputation could determine their entire future. Being seen as a traitor did not mean only emotional guilt. It meant social destruction, different looks, whispers, public humiliation. And Judas may have already started to feel that happening, because news spread quickly, especially during Passover. People were talking about Jesus' arrest, about the trial, about the religious leaders. And inevitably, the name Judas would begin circulating through the city. But there's something even heavier hidden inside this story. The Bible says Judas tried to return the money. That changes everything, because it shows the remorse came before the death. Now imagine the scene in reality. Judas walking back toward the temple area. The same priests, the same authorities, the same men who had negotiated the betrayal. The air probably smelled of incense and sacrificial blood. Coins clattered. People debated religious offerings. Animals cried out near the market areas. And in the middle of all that chaos, Judas appears emotionally shattered, perhaps sleepless, perhaps sweating, perhaps speaking too quickly. The guilt was beginning to crush him from the inside. And the cruelest part is that the priests almost ignore his suffering. To them, the deal had already been completed. That reveals something brutal about Jerusalem at that time. People could be politically useful one moment and disposable the next, especially inside religious power struggles. And this is where everything truly begins collapsing, because Judas realizes something horrifying. There is no way back anymore. Jesus has been condemned, the disciples have fled, the priests do not care, and the city continues moving as if nothing happened. But there's another dark detail most people never notice. At that very moment, Judas could probably still hear the ordinary sounds of Jerusalem in the distance. Hammers striking stone, animals crying out, merchants shouting, prayers echoing from the temple. Life continued, even while his mind was completely falling apart. And when a man loses his place inside society, Jerusalem could become a prison without walls. There's a romanticized image of the biblical world that hides an uncomfortable truth. Living in Jerusalem during that time was psychologically brutal, especially for someone like Judas, because the city operated through fear. Fear of Rome, fear of hunger, fear of violence, fear of religious judgment. Executions were public. Pain was used as a warning. Crosses standing beside roads reminded the people exactly what happened to those who challenged the system. And that changes the way we see the final moments of Judas completely. Because he knew exactly what was happening to Jesus. He knew the kind of punishment Rome delivered. He knew how prisoners were humiliated, beaten, displayed before crowds, and here the reality becomes even darker. Crucifixion was not simply death. It was the public destruction of human dignity. The Romans wanted people to feel fear just by looking at a condemned man. Now imagine Judas trying to process all of that. Maybe he realized too late that the priests never intended merely to question Jesus. Maybe, in that moment, he understood that he had helped hand Jesus over to a Roman execution machine. And there's another disturbing detail: emotional isolation. In that culture, belonging meant everything. Family, community, religion, group identity. People lived surrounded by others constantly. Eating alone already felt strange. Sleeping without a group could be dangerous. Traveling alone was risky, and Judas loses all of it at once. He no longer has the disciples. He is not part of the religious elite either. And he probably can no longer endure his own conscience. The Bible summarizes this in only a few lines, but in real life. A mental collapse like that does not happen silently. The body feels it. Hands tremble. The stomach tightens. The heart races. Sleep disappears. Physical guilt can destroy a person. And Jerusalem offered no space for emotional weakness. There was no psychological support, no emotional refuge, no easy escape. The city was dense, crowded, always watching. And the more the news of Jesus' condemnation spread, the more suffocating the city probably became for Judas. But there's something even more disturbing. The accounts describing his death themselves carry tension. The Gospel of Matthew says Judas hanged himself, but in the book of Acts, the description speaks of a violent fall of the body. For centuries, people have tried to understand the difference. Were the accounts complementary? Different moments? Or separate versions preserved over time? And it is exactly that uncertainty that makes the story even darker. Because the final moments of Judas seem surrounded by chaos, as if even his death carried confusion, shame, and abandonment. And there's another important historical detail. The field associated with Judas's death became known as the Field of Blood. Even the name itself reveals how deeply the story scarred people's memories. Jerusalem never fully forgot what happened, because betrayal was despised in that culture at a profound level, far beyond a simple moral mistake. A traitor became permanently marked, and maybe Judas's greatest punishment was not only his death, but the hours leading up to it. Hours in which he probably wandered through a living city, while internally everything had already collapsed. After Judas died, silence begins. And that may be one of the strangest parts of the entire story, because the Bible does not follow the final details of his body. It does not describe a funeral. It does not mention mourning. It does not show anyone trying to save him. It is as if Judas suddenly disappears from the narrative. But Jerusalem probably kept speaking about him for a very long time, because ancient cities lived through collective memory. People repeated stories in the streets, in the markets, during meals, near the temple, and the name Judas became a symbol of betrayal, a symbol so powerful that it crossed centuries. But there's a question almost nobody asks. What happened to the places connected to his death? According to the accounts, the money returned by the priests was used to buy a field, a piece of land associated with death, blood, shame, and that reveals a great deal about that society. Because places carried spiritual meaning, certain areas were seen as impure, marked, cursed. The so-called field of blood probably became a place many people avoided. Imagine it in reality: dry ground, scattered stones, low vegetation burning beneath the sun, silence interrupted only by the wind, and people passing nearby quietly telling stories about the man who betrayed Jesus. But there's an even more human detail hidden inside all of this. While Judas disappeared from the story, the other disciples kept living. Peter, who also failed by denying Jesus, eventually returned to the group, and that creates a powerful contrast. Two men failed, but their final paths became completely different. And maybe that is exactly why the story of Judas still disturbs people 2,000 years later, because it touches something deeply human. What happens when someone believes there is no way back? In reality, Jerusalem at that time could emotionally crush a person. The religious pressure was enormous. Public shame was brutal. Social humiliation could destroy entire identities, and Judas seems to sink completely beneath all of it. But perhaps the most terrifying detail is something else. The city continued normally after those events. Markets reopened, soldiers continued patrolling, priests continued performing rituals, people kept buying bread and sacrificing animals. The world did not stop, and that is one of the harshest truths about real life. Even during the most devastating moments, cities keep breathing. Jerusalem remained alive, but it would never truly be the same again, because the events of those days left deep scars behind. The crucifixion of Jesus, the disappearance of Judas, the fear of the disciples, the political tension, all of it became embedded in the memory of that generation. And years later, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, many of the streets Judas once walked vanished beneath fire, blood, and collapsing stone, as if the city itself carried scars from that period. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about Judas Iscariot is not only the betrayal, but the loneliness, the realization that the weight of one's own choices arrived too late. Because when we think about this story, it is easy to see only the biblical character. But there was a real man there, a man walking through narrow streets, hearing Roman footsteps echo against stone, smelling blood drifting from the temple, trying to escape his own mind while Jerusalem remained alive around him. And maybe that is exactly why this story still feels so heavy after 2,000 years. The Bible shows the events, but the silence between the verses reveals the human side, the fear, the guilt, the emotional collapse, the feeling of having nowhere left to return. And there is one question that still remains today. What was the exact moment Judas realized everything was lost? Was it when he accepted the silver? When he saw Jesus arrested? When he heard the crowd? Or when he realized nobody was standing beside him anymore? Maybe we will never know. But one thing is certain. During those final hours, Jerusalem was not only the city where Jesus would be crucified, it also became the city where Judas Iscariot disappeared inside his own guilt.